Welcome to Tardisian Files. In today's episode, we're going to be discussing one of the Doctor's oldest foes, second only to the Master in both intellect and insanity. It's Davros, the creator of the Daleks. This is something I've wanted to discuss for a while now, ever since the 2023 Children in Need sketch where we saw the 14th Doctor coming into contact with a younger version of Davros, played by the current actor Julian Bleach. Davros' backstory and history are of great fascination to me. How did Davros become the villain we know him as? And more importantly, have we as the audience been too harsh to brand him as such? Well, that's what we're here to discuss today. Disclaimer: before we get into today's review, this episode contains discussions on socio-political topics that some viewers may find offensive. While this podcast aims to avoid getting too deeply into political debates, the topics brought up in today's discussion were deemed too important not to raise as part of the wider review. Therefore, measures have been taken to ensure that they have been handled respectfully. Listener discretion is advised. We'll start with the life of Davros, long ago on the planet of Skaro. Davros was born in the latter half of the Thousand Years' War between the Khaleds and the Thals, to a Khaled woman named Lady Cacula and her lover, Councillor Quested. Growing up, Davros was unaware of his paternity, assuming that his stepfather, Colonel Nazgard, was his biological father. Davros also had a maternal half-sister, Yarvel, with whom he would often watch anti-Thal propaganda with growing up. At this time in the war, between the Thals and the Khaleds, it had become so brutal that mercy and nobility, once values held in high regard by the Khaleds, had long since been abandoned. Colonel Nazgard wanted Davros to become a soldier like himself, though Davros, who had shown keen intellect from a young age, was determined to become a scientist. Though one would think that this would keep Davros away from the battleground, this would not be so, as unlike his sister, who had seen the pointlessness of the war through the propaganda as she noted how it only ever depicted a Skaro that no longer existed, Davros took a different outlook on the war. He believed that the only way to end it was to wipe out the Thals and for the Khaleds to dominate the planet. So while Yarvel went on to dedicate her life to peace advocacy, Davros joined the military youth in his final year of college, before joining the Khaled Scientific Corps, based in the Khaled Dome. Some accounts vary as to when Davros began developing the life support system that would become known as the Dalek machine. However, if the Children in Need special from 2023 is to be taken as canon, it started before Davros' grave injury, and his creation would be altered by a newly regenerated 14th Doctor who replaced a scary-looking claw arm with a plunger, having broken it off the machine when the TARDIS crashed into Davros' lab while the scientist had stepped out. When Davros returned, he found his lab assistant gawking at the altered machine, and decided that he loved the alteration. Shortly after this, Davros would be terribly injured in an aerial strike on the Khaled Dome by the Thals, destroying his lab and rendering his right arm and both his legs useless, as well as leaving the scientist with severe burns, impaired vision and speech, as well as many internal ailments, requiring him to be on constant life support. Now confined to his Mark I travel machine, a wheelchair-like machine with built-in life support and implants allowing him to see and speak, Davros was met with hostility from his peers. On Skaro at this time, mutated Khaleds and Thals, or Mutos as they were unkindly dubbed, were viewed as second-class citizens by both sides. As Davros was now reliant on his Mark I travel machine for survival, he was met with the same stigma and ignorance from his peers, keeping kept in the lower level labs in the dome and given smaller, less important projects to work on, effectively being given free rein to do as he pleased while being ostracised. This alienation, however, may very well have been the final trigger for Davros to begin developing his Mark III travel machine. Having discovered that the humanoid Khaleds were devolving into hapless mutants due to thousands of years of radiation and harmful chemical exposure, Davros took Khaled cells and accelerated the mutations, cloning a model of what the Khaled's final mutated form would be. Once he saw the pitiful creatures, he perfected the Mark III travel machine to both house the mutants and provide them with a mobile offensive unit, to achieve the goal he'd been serving since he was a young child, the eradication of the Thals. Davros also made changes to the mutants, however, removing their ability to feel or imagine, only allowing them to experience logic and hate. Upon unveiling the new Daleks, a name that was an anagram of Khaled, he was met by mixed reactions from the scientific corps. While some were impressed, others felt that the mutants needed to be able to feel, and that by removing their emotions, this was a step too far. It was at this point in time when the Doctor arrived with Harry Sullivan and Sarah Jane Smith, the three having been recruited by the Time Lords to either prevent the Daleks from being created, or alter their evolution to make them less aggressive. The Doctor tried to convince Davros to stop what he was doing, but the scientist's hatred for the Thals had consumed him at this point. Not only did he have his Daleks wipe out most of the Thal soldiers and civilians at the Thal Dome, but he also previously worked with Thal scientists to give them a chemical that would weaken the Khaled Dome and to develop their neutronic missiles, thus allowing Davros to justify the mass production of the Dalek machines to his fellow Khaled scientists, manipulating both sides. Davros then proceeded to have the Daleks kill all of the Khaled scientists who were not in favour of making the Daleks completely emotionless. In a twist of fate, however, these Daleks then proceeded to kill the loyal scientists, killing them first before declaring that they were above Davros. Davros tried to destroy their production lines, but was unable to reach the button in time before the Daleks seemingly killed him too. However, like his Dalek children, Davros has a knack for survival. Instead of dying, Davros' secondary life support systems activated, and his body was left in suspended animation, slowly repairing himself for decades, while the Daleks escaped the sealed Khaled Dome and proceeded to kill most of the Thals and all of the Khaleds remaining on Skaro before venturing out into the universe. This set a precedent for Davros' life from then on, as he would go on to spend great lengths of time in and out of suspended animation. Time passed, and like many bratty children in history, the Daleks got into a fight that they couldn't win, against the Movellans. So what did they do? They came running back to Papa. Davros was still in the ruins of the Khaled Dome on Skaro at this point, and the Daleks' arrival on the planet triggered his reanimation. Due to the TARDIS randomizer, the Fourth Doctor and Romana arrived on Skaro at the same time, learning of the Dalek and Movellan War. While the Daleks succeeded in reviving Davros, his contribution to the Movellan-Dalek War was short-lived, as he was soon put back into suspended animation, sealed in ice this time, after the Doctor, Romana, and escaped human slaves the Daleks prevented them from blowing up the Movellan ship. Unbeknownst to all of them, Davros was conscious the whole time, immobile but aware of his surroundings. Around the same time, circa 4500 AD, the human empire recovered Davros in his cryogenic state, and sentenced him to an eternity in ice. Pretty hard to have a fair trial when one is incapable of responding, but apparently this was legal. So, Davros then spent 90 years in total, sealed in ice, still conscious and plotting. The Daleks eventually caught up with their creator, locating him on a human prison station, which they then attacked and awoke Davros from his sleep. Once again, the Daleks needed help with their war against the Movellans. This time, the Movellans had developed a virus that only attacked Dalek tissue, and it had become a tipping point in the war. The Daleks' numbers were dwindling. Davros, after spending decades of plotting, used this as an opportunity to undermine the Supreme Dalek, experimenting on 2 of the Daleks to make them subservient to him. However, due to intervention from the 5th Doctor, Davros was found out, and he proceeded to release the Movellan virus onto the station, killing most of the Daleks and unintentionally infecting himself with the virus, not accounting for the fact that his Khaled tissue was likely vulnerable to the virus in the same way the Daleks were. Though not dead, Davros was now left in a critical state, floating in space in an escape pod which he had managed to launch before a rogue Dalek double had destroyed his prison station. He eventually landed on the human colony of Necros, where he established himself as the Great Healer and head of the Tranquil Repose funeral home, a place where rich colonists could freeze themselves if they became terminally ill while awaiting treatment. This was a ruse, however, as Davros was actually taking the bodies and mutating them into new Daleks loyal to him. Davros was foiled when the 6th Doctor arrived, along with an agent from Earth's Secret Service who'd grown suspicious of the Great Healer. In a confrontation that saw Davros lose his remaining hand, the Skaro Daleks, who were out for revenge after their last encounter with their creator, were summoned. They overpowered the Necros Daleks and then proceeded to arrest Davros, intending to put him back on trial on Skaro. It's unclear how Davros' trial went, as conflicting accounts exist. However, what is clear is that Davros either gained support from one faction of Daleks, who adopted the Imperial Dalek casing, or he generated a new race of Imperial Daleks. In either case, Davros' faction reclaimed Skaro and most of the Dalek Empire for themselves, which sent the Renegade faction running. This began the Dalek Civil War, with Davros finally in his rightful seat, in his mind, as the Emperor of the Daleks. The war was fought predominantly in the 47th century, however the fighting eventually made its way back through time as both factions sought out the Hand of Omega, which they learned the 1st Doctor had left behind in Shoreditch in 1963. This device would allow them to create their own version of the Eye of Harmony, finally gaining full access to time travel rather than having to rely on their limited time corridors and time controller devices. The 7th Doctor and Ace arrived in 1963 at this time, and while the Daleks were busy fighting each other, the Doctor used this as cover to reprogram the Hand of Omega. When Davros' faction recovered the hand, he activated it, intending for Skaro's son to be the star that would be used in this experiment. Considering how the hand would cause stars to go supernova and then collapse into a black hole, this was a major miscalculation, even if the device worked as intended to, but it's fair to say that Davros' judgment may not have been the best at the time. To his horror, instead of creating a new Eye of Harmony, Skaro's sun went supernova and completely destroyed the planet. The Hand of Omega wasn't finished either. It was returning to destroy the Imperial Daleks. Fleeing in an escape pod, Davros was once again left adrift in space, with his race dead, and he was all alone. Varying accounts exist from both the comics, the audios, and stories alike of what Davros did next. One account stated that there were surviving factions of Daleks that had left Skaro but hadn't partaken in the Civil War. They retrieved Davros from a garbage ship called the Quetzal, and they proceeded to tell him that he had actually destroyed the Renegade's decoy world of Antolin, and so they took him back to the real Skaro for another trial. in which this time he successfully pleaded his case to them and they welcomed him back as their creator. Another account suggested that Davros made his way to the planet of Azimuth, where he had previously set up a research base years prior. He intended to upload his mind into a healthy clone body of himself that he had also left behind and contact surviving Daleks. However, he discovered that this clone had been activated in his absence and developed its own personality, taking on the name of Fulcus. Fulcus then proceeded to create his own race of Daleks, which Davros did not approve of, and therefore he destroyed them all. A third account states that Davros finally went insane, or more so at this point, and developed the death particle that the Fourth Doctor once made him theorise about centuries earlier. He then used it to conquer Earth and took humans to be converted into a new race of Daleks. In either case, Davros survived and aided the Daleks' war effort in the last Great Time War, which was their retaliation against the Time Lords after becoming aware of multiple instances of Time Lord interference in their history. Davros' main participation in the war came during the first year of the conflict. His task was to create the perfect Dalek, a creature with an insatiable hunger for everything, otherwise known as the Nightmare Child. However, having learned seemingly nothing from his early Daleks about teaching impulse control, Davros was unable to control the beast, and ended up luring it to the gates of Elysium to destroy it. It's unclear, based on conflicting accounts, if this was a show just to spite the War Doctor by deliberately piloting his craft into the Nightmare Child's jaws, or if it was a freak accident. But Davros' command ship fell into the jaws of the Nightmare Child as the monster itself was falling through the gates of Elysium. Davros was assumed dead, another casualty of the Time War, the last of the Khaleds rendered extinct. But by some unknown means, Dalek Khan was able to penetrate the Time War's time lock and retrieve Davros. I personally like the explanation laid out by the web series The Dalek That Time Forgot, however this is mostly disregarded as non-canon. Either way, a now insane Dalek Khan took Davros into the post-war universe in 2009, where they set up their base in the Medusa Cascade. Davros proceeded to use cells from his own body to create new Daleks. Why he chose this method instead of cloning Dalek Khan is unclear, but this man has a god complex, so that's the most likely explanation. The new Dalek Empire proceeded to steal 27 planets from time and space in order to build their new weapon, the reality bomb. Another creation from Davros' insane mind, it would effectively create a death wave much like Sutek's across the universe, leaving only the Daleks. The Daleks were defeated by Donna Noble using her newfound Metacrisis abilities to hack their systems and disable the weapon, returning the planets to their orbits and leaving the Daleks unable to control their casings. The Metacrisis Doctor then proceeded to take Donna's hack a step further and destroyed the Daleks. The mass destruction caused the Crucible to fall apart and self-destruct, with Davros on board. Did he perish? Of course not. Escaping once again, Davros eventually realised that he was dying, properly this time. And so he returned home to a restored Skaro and created a lifelink machine to leech the life force off of the Daleks to extend his life. Though his ultimate goal was to lure the 12th Doctor and siphon regeneration energy from him in order to restore himself to life and broadcast the energy into the Daleks to make them more powerful. Whatever that meant. Though he was technically successful, he was too successful, as Davros ended up reviving the living dead Dalek mutants in the sewers, who then proceeded to attack the city above out of anger for being abandoned. Davros hasn't been seen since this encounter, though he no doubt survived, as later accounts suggest that he discovered he was no longer reliant on his life force extender or the life support systems in his chair. Who knows, maybe he finally succeeded in securing a new body for himself and is wandering the universe freely, just waiting to meet the Doctor again. So, monster or misunderstood? Now that we understand Davros' history, we can begin to ponder the question, is Davros really a villain? On the surface, yes he is. He's committed unthinkable acts, killed countless people, including his own race, all for the sake of chasing fanatical goals, to create the ultimate killing machine and to wipe out the Thals, the latter of which he failed in. Davros is manipulative, spiteful, vengeful, and ruthless, and not to mention, completely insane. So that's it, right? We've heard his endless list of crimes against the universe, he's the villain in his story, case closed, right? But is it? Is Davros really to blame for his outlook on life? Here, I'm going to play devil's advocate and propose that he isn't. Not entirely, anyway. Though some accounts suggest that Davros was cold and manipulative from a young age, and may very well have experimented on the bodies of his sister and his mother when they both died, televised depictions of his youth show nothing more than a scared child growing up in an endless bitter war, which has led me to wonder if Davros may be more sympathetic than we think. Here are my reasons. 1. He was born into conflict, surrounded by xenophobic propaganda. This alone would have been enough to distort the young Davros' mind to become more xenophobic and resentful, as he would have picked up on the views that had been held by coloured society as he was growing up. Not to mention that he may have had trauma related to attacks from the Thals if he had been in coloured settlements that had been targeted growing up. Considering the fact that his stepfather was in the military, and that a young Davros did wander onto the battlefield at least once growing up, this seems more than likely. 2. His xenophobia towards the Thals was validated when he was caught in the aerial blast that crippled him for life and led to him being ostracised by his fellow Carlets. Davros' whole life, he'd heard about how terrible the Thals were, and this attack would have proven in his mind everything that he was told to believe as a child, that the Thals were his enemy, and they must be destroyed. They were to blame for his injury, and therefore the war became personal for Davros. 3. Davros was alienated by his own peers for an injury that wasn't his fault. Davros went from being a fit, energetic man, serving his people and receiving respect for that service, to being confined to a wheelchair, constantly in pain. Instead of being given the support that he needed to help him come to terms with this injury, he was treated like a second-class citizen, effectively left on his own with no one to care for him. This disgusting treatment by the Coloureds likely would have made Davros loathe his own people just as much as he loathed the Thals, and his isolation would have made it all too easy for his fixation on survival and the eradication of the Thals to become a full-blown obsession, leading him to create the Daleks. Davros' behaviour and relationship with the Daleks may also stem back to this alienation. Davros sought to create a race of beings that would strive to be the superior beings, but he always yearned for them to recognise him as his equal. This indicates that Davros also harboured feelings of self-loathing, and his self-destructive behaviours, which always led him back to the Daleks, further support this. Whether it's constantly recreating the Daleks wherever he landed, or releasing the Mavellan virus to spite the Daleks when they rejected him, this toxic codependent relationship that he formed with his quote-unquote children shows a need for acceptance, and in many of Davros' appearances, we hear him air his frustrations at being constantly disregarded by the Daleks. And 4. Finally, Davros was consistently punished incredibly harshly, often without fair trial or sympathy, from both the Doctor and others who sought to stop him. Ever since Davros' accident, he was constantly locked up and neglected, first by the Carleds, then by the Daleks, then by the Human Empire, and then by the Daleks again. Davros has been left in suspended animation on multiple occasions, fully aware of what was happening during his confinement, but unable to move or do anything, which would have only caused him further mental distress and reinforced his resentful behaviour. Even in confrontations with the Doctor, has led to some fairly violent acts either from the Doctor or whoever he's with in an attempt to stop Davros. The Sixth Doctor stood by and let somebody shoot Davros's final remaining hand, which obliterated it, and the Fourth Doctor used Davros's life support systems against him, threatening to switch them off if he didn't comply with what the Doctor was telling him. And finally, the Doctor tricked him into destroying his own planet. It wasn't enough to just use the Hand of Omega to destroy the Daleks. The Doctor decided to eradicate Davros's homeworld, which he had sacrificed years of his life, ultimately to bring peace to. Because in a warped, twisted way, Davros originally only ever wanted to bring peace to his homeworld. He just went about it in the very wrong way. Why might we as the audience not view Davros favourably? Well, despite the circumstances of Davros's life, he is still responsible for his actions, and they have been utterly evil. There is no denying that Davros would rather do what was easy over what was right. Additionally, we often see Davros from other people's perspectives, usually when his plans are close to fruition, and the Doctor has no choice but to take drastic action to stop Davros before he endangers the lives of countless others. Another element of Davros's characterisation that may make him less sympathetic has to do with a controversial trope used in film that has been addressed by Russell T Davies in interviews surrounding the Children in Need special in 2023. In an interview printed in Radio Times, when explaining why Davros was going to be seen in his pre-injury days for all future appearances, Davies said that, and I quote, "There's a problem with the Davros of old in that he's a wheelchair user, who is evil. And I had problems with that, and a lot of us on the production team had problems with that, of associating disability with evil. And trust me, there's a very long tradition of this." End quote. After doing some of my own research, I found that this is true. Disability and disfigurement is unfortunately used fairly often as part of a villain's character in some way to make them less sympathetic to the audiences, by playing on unconscious bias that the audience may have around physical appearances. This sounds very much like the way the Khaleds responded to Davros after his accident. However, it could potentially explain part of the reason why the Doctor Who audience historically has found Davros hard to sympathise with, because of his admittedly frightening appearance. In some episodes, this actually goes further, with the protagonists actively using Davros's inability to fight back against him. The 12th Doctor used Davros's disability to wrestle him out of his chair, and in the same episode, Missy poked Davros in his optical implant, causing him pain, which she laughed at. The 4th Doctor weaponised Davros's life support system in a bid to get him to stop producing Dalek machines. The 6th Doctor allowed a man to shoot Davros's only remaining hand to overpower him. And finally, the 5th Doctor went as far as to point a gun at the vulnerable scientist. All of these actions are highly controversial, as it clearly shows the protagonists of the episode taking advantage of Davros's disability. To avoid this very negative use of Davros's ability in the storytelling in future episodes, RTD has stated that Davros's future appearances will only feature him in his pre-injury days, likely to recharacterise him as a villain who is evil because he is a villain, and separate Davros from his old backstory. Considering everything that we've mentioned above, this sounds like it's probably for the best. In conclusion, even though Davros is responsible for his inexcusable actions, I don't think it's fair to label him as just a villain. For one thing, he was never taught good values by any of the any of the adults in his life growing up, allowing him to develop hateful and vengeful behaviour. He was then not supported after his injury, instead was alienated, only causing further resentment of others and himself to build up within him. He has been pretty mercilessly punished on several occasions, only making his cold outlook on life worse, and above all, the Doctor, the Thals, and the Khaleds have never taken responsibility for their part in turning Davros into the person he is today. The Thals were responsible for his injury in the first place. The Khaleds never supported him when he needed it, and the Doctor, the one person who may actually be able to offer Davros the support he needs and possibly even treatment for some of his ailments, has never offered it, or almost never offered it. It certainly makes one think about the so-called pacifist values held by the Doctor and by the Thals when they have always resorted to violence when coming face to face with Davros. What do you guys think? Has Davros been treated unfairly? Is he deserving of the villain title? Let us know in the comments section on our YouTube channel and on our social media pages. In our research for today's discussion, we found the video by The Take titled "Why the Disabled Villain Trope is So Offensive" to be particularly helpful, and so we've linked it in the description for this episode. We recommend this for anyone who wishes to know more about this topic, as it explains very well the controversies surrounding the use of disabled characters as villains. You can listen to all of our episodes of the podcast on YouTube, YouTube Music, Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also follow us on Instagram and TikTok using the handle @TardisianFilesPodcasts to get the latest updates on upcoming episodes. And as always, see you next time on Tardisian Files.